Washington Democrats made up their minds to impeach President Trump before he was even inaugurated.
Donald Trump is a living, breathing, impeachable offense.
Donald Trump is facing an impeachment trial again. No president has ever been impeached twice, and no president has ever gone on trial after leaving office. It's fair to say we're in pretty uncharted territory. So what's the case against him? Donald Trump is accused of inciting violence against the government. Specifically this, the storming of Congress by thousands of his supporters. But his accusers say you have to go back a couple of months to last November's presidential election.
We know there was massive fraud.
That was a rigged election.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win.
Trump lost, but refused to admit it. Not only that.
Okay, so this is one of those stories that should be absolutely everywhere right now, because what just happened in a federal courtroom is a massive blow to everything Trump has been trying to do with his so-called retribution campaign since he got back into office earlier this year. For months now, we have been watching Trump use the Department of Justice as his personal weapon to go after anyone and everyone who ever investigated him or held him accountable for anything during his years in and out of office. And just when it looked like he was getting away with turning the federal government into a revenge machine with no consequences, a federal judge steps in and says, no, not like this. You cannot do this, and throws out the entire thing in spectacular fashion. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
But when the state of Georgia was getting ready to hold a second round of voting to settle two very close Senate races, Mr. Trump is accused of trying to intervene illegally.
I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
It all came to a head on January the 6th, when Congress was due to confirm the results of the presidential election. In a long, bitter speech, Mr. Trump railed against the entire election process.
We fight like hell.
Here is what went down and why this matters so much for understanding where we are right now as a country dealing with unprecedented abuses of power. Trump's Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, brought criminal indictments against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, two of the most prominent people who have investigated Trump over the years and actually held him accountable for various misconduct that would have ended anyone else's career. These were not routine prosecutions based on evidence that career prosecutors developed over time through normal investigative channels. These were targeted attacks on Trump's perceived enemies, using the full power of the federal government to punish people simply for doing their jobs and following the evidence wherever it happened to lead them. And a federal judge just looked at these cases and said, this is not how any of this works in America. The judge ruled that the special prosecutor who brought these charges was illegally appointed in the first place. The whole thing was improper from the very start. The cases are dismissed completely, gone, thrown out of court. Trump's big revenge plot that was supposed to send a message to anyone who might ever think about investigating him in the future, it just collapsed in spectacular fashion in front of everyone watching, and there is nothing he can do about it right now. Now, I want you to really understand what was happening here before the judge stepped in and put a stop to it, because the scope of what Trump was trying to do is genuinely terrifying when you think about the implications for democracy and the rule of law in this country. James Comey, whatever you think about his decisions during the 2016 election and his handling of the Clinton email investigation, was the FBI director who refused to shut down the Russia investigation when Trump demanded personal loyalty from him in a private dinner. Trump fired him for that refusal and has been absolutely obsessed with punishing him ever since that day in 2017. The indictment against Comey was payback, pure and simple, an attempt to use criminal charges to destroy someone who would not bend the knee when the president demanded it. Letitia James is an even more obvious target for retaliation because she is the New York Attorney General who brought the massive civil fraud case against Trump that resulted in official court findings that he lied to banks for an entire decade about his finances and property values. The court found Trump liable for fraud, and that finding still stands on the record today, and Trump has been absolutely furious about it ever since the ruling came down against him. So what does he do when he gets back into power with the full force of the federal government behind him? He has his Justice Department indict the woman who exposed his fraud to the world. The message could not possibly be clearer to anyone paying attention. Investigate Trump and you will be destroyed using the power of the federal government. But here's the thing about using the Justice Department as a weapon against your political enemies. You still have to follow the rules and the law and the Constitution, even when you are the president trying to punish people who crossed you. And that is exactly where Trump's whole scheme fell apart, in the most embarrassing way possible. The judge examined how the special prosecutor was appointed and found that it was done improperly, that the prosecutor did not have the legal authority to bring these charges in the first place. It is a huge procedural problem that goes right to the heart of whether these prosecutions were ever legitimate or whether they were just political theater designed to intimidate Trump's critics into silence. The judge threw out both cases entirely with no ambiguity whatsoever. Comey walks free. Letitia James walks free. Trump's big statement about what happens to people who cross him, it just evaporated in the courtroom because even with all his power, he could not get the basic legal procedures right. And that tells you something really important about how this whole retribution campaign has been run from the very beginning. It was never really about justice or accountability or protecting the country from anything. It was always about revenge and intimidation and sending a message. And when you build prosecutions on that kind of foundation instead of on solid legal ground, they tend to collapse when they actually have to hold up in front of an independent judge. All right, so let me walk you through exactly what happened here and why this ruling matters so much for the bigger picture of what Trump has been trying to do with the Justice Department since he took office for his second term back in January. Because this is not just about two individual cases getting thrown out of court. This is about the entire strategy of using federal prosecutions as political weapons and whether that strategy can actually survive contact with the courts and the Constitution when it faces real legal scrutiny from judges who are still willing to do their jobs. Let us start with the background on what Trump's retribution campaign actually looks like in practice, because the full scope of it is really important to understand if you want to grasp why this ruling matters so much. From the moment Trump got back into office, he made it absolutely clear that he was going to use the Justice Department to go after his enemies without any pretense of neutrality or fairness. He said it openly during the campaign when he was asking for votes. He said it after the election when he was planning his administration. And then he started actually doing it with real indictments and real prosecutions against people who had investigated him or held him accountable in various ways over the years. This was not subtle political maneuvering. This was an open declaration that crossing Trump would result in criminal prosecution regardless of whether you actually committed any crimes that would normally be prosecuted. James Comey was one of the first and most prominent targets because Trump has been nursing a personal grudge against him since 2017 when Comey refused to pledge personal loyalty and would not shut down the FBI investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election that Trump found so threatening to his legitimacy. Trump fired Comey in dramatic fashion, and that firing ended up contributing directly to the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller and years of investigations that Trump found humiliating and infuriating every single day they continued. Comey became a symbol of everything Trump hates about the so-called deep state career officials who follow the law and the evidence, rather than doing whatever Trump wants them to do when he demands it. The indictment against Comey was built on what legal experts across the political spectrum described as extremely thin grounds that would never have been pursued against anyone who was not on Trump's personal enemies list. The charges related to his handling of classified materials and alleged procedural violations during his time running the FBI, the kind of technical infractions that might result in administrative consequences or a reprimand for a normal federal employee, but almost never result in criminal prosecution because prosecutors have better things to do with limited resources. The fact that Trump's Justice Department was pursuing serious criminal charges over these minor issues made it obvious to everyone watching that this was about punishment and revenge rather than anything resembling actual justice. Letitia James was an even more obvious target for retaliation because her investigation directly resulted in court findings that embarrassed Trump and damaged his carefully cultivated image as a brilliant businessman who turned a small loan into a massive empire through genius deal-making. Her office spent years examining Trump Organization financial records with forensic precision and ultimately proved in court that Trump had committed fraud by inflating his property values to get better loan terms from banks that would not have given him such favorable treatment if they had known the truth. The fraud finding still stands as established legal fact that cannot be disputed. The appeals court that threw out the financial penalty did not overturn the underlying determination that Trump lied to banks systematically for a decade. And Trump has been absolutely obsessed with punishing James for exposing this fraud ever since the ruling came down against him. The indictment against Letitia James was supposedly related to mortgage fraud allegations from years ago that had nothing to do with her investigation of Trump, but the timing and the circumstances made it completely obvious to anyone paying attention what was really going on here. You investigate Trump and find evidence of fraud that results in official court findings against him. You get indicted yourself by his Justice Department on unrelated charges that suddenly become important after years of being ignored. The message was crystal clear to every prosecutor, investigator in the country who might be thinking about looking into Trump's affairs. Think twice before you look into anything Trump has done, because this is exactly what happens to people who have the audacity to hold him accountable for his actions. But here is where Trump's whole scheme ran into a fundamental problem that he apparently did not anticipate or simply did not care about, because he assumed he could bulldoze through any legal obstacle to bring these prosecutions. His Justice Department had to appoint a special prosecutor because of the obvious conflicts of interest involved in the administration prosecuting its own political enemies who had previously investigated the president himself, and the way they appointed that prosecutor turned out to be legally improper, according to the federal judge who actually reviewed the cases with fresh eyes and an independent perspective. The prosecutor did not have the proper legal authority to bring these charges in the first place. The appointment process was flawed in fundamental ways that violated established legal requirements that exist for very good reasons. The judge's ruling was not about whether Comey or James actually did anything wrong that deserved prosecution. The judge did not examine the evidence in detail and decide they were innocent of the charges against them. What the judge said was that the prosecutions themselves were improper from the very start because the prosecutor bringing them was not legally authorized to do so under the applicable rules and regulations. This is a procedural knockout that ends the cases entirely without ever getting to the merits of the accusations or the evidence that was supposedly gathered. And it suggests strongly that the Trump Justice Department was so focused on pursuing revenge as quickly as possible that they did not bother to make sure they were following the proper procedures that would allow them to do it legally. Now, some people might look at this outcome and say, well, they can just fix the procedural problems and bring the charges again with a properly appointed prosecutor who has the legal authority to pursue these cases. And technically, that might be possible in some circumstances, depending on how the Justice Department responds to this ruling. But this ruling does real damage to the credibility and momentum of Trump's retribution campaign, regardless of what happens next with these specific cases. It shows that these prosecutions were sloppy and improper from day one. It shows that the administration was cutting corners in their eagerness to punish Trump's enemies before anyone could stop them. It shows that when these cases actually had to hold up in front of an independent judge who was doing their job, they fell apart immediately under the slightest scrutiny. And here's what makes this even more significant. In the broader context of 2025 politics and where we are as a country, Trump has been telling his supporters for years that the justice system was weaponized against him, that all the investigations and prosecutions he faced were politically motivated attacks rather than legitimate law enforcement following the evidence. And there were certainly elements of his cases that raised legitimate questions about timing and priorities and whether he was being treated the same way any other defendant would be treated in similar circumstances. But what Trump is doing now to his enemies is so much more blatant and so much more dangerous than anything that was ever done to him by any prosecutor. Trump faced investigations that followed normal legal procedures and went through proper channels with appropriately appointed prosecutors and oversight from judges at every step of the process. The cases against him, the classified documents case, and the January 6th case, and the various state prosecutions, all followed established legal frameworks, even if you disagree with the decisions to bring them or think they were politically motivated. What Trump is doing to his enemies is completely different in kind. It is using the Justice Department as an openly acknowledged weapon of political revenge without even pretending that normal legal standards apply or matter at all. Okay? So let us break down exactly what this ruling means and why it matters for understanding where we are right now as a country dealing with the president who openly views the Justice Department as his personal revenge machine to be used against anyone who ever crossed him. Because this is not just a legal story about procedural technicalities that only lawyers care about. This is a story about power and accountability and whether there are any real limits on what a president can do to punish people who have the audacity to investigate him or hold him accountable. Point number one, the dismissal of these cases represents a real defeat for Trump's retribution campaign, even if he tries to spin it otherwise in his public statements and social media posts. Trump wanted to send a clear message that investigating him has serious consequences that will destroy your life and career. He wanted Comey and James to be convicted and punished and humiliated as a warning to anyone else who might think about holding him accountable for anything in the future. Instead, both of them walk free today, and the prosecutions are exposed as legally improper from the very start. That is not the message Trump wanted to send. That is the exact opposite of the message he wanted to send. It shows that his revenge plot was sloppy and rushed and could not survive even basic legal scrutiny from a judge who was willing to do their job. Point number 2. The ruling highlights how the Trump Justice Department cut corners and ignored proper procedures in their eagerness to punish the president's enemies as quickly as possible before anyone could mount a defense. When you are bringing criminal prosecutions against high-profile political figures, you need to make absolutely sure you are following every rule and every procedure perfectly, because you know these cases will face intense scrutiny from defense lawyers and judges and the media. The fact that these prosecutions failed on procedural grounds, that the special prosecutor was not properly appointed according to established legal requirements, suggests that the Justice Department was more focused on speed and political impact than on building cases that could actually hold up in court. That is what happens when law enforcement becomes a political weapon rather than a neutral institution following the evidence. Point number 3. This ruling demonstrates that there are still some checks on presidential power even in this environment where Trump seems to be getting away with almost everything he tries with no consequences. It would be easy to look at the past year and conclude that Trump can do whatever he wants with no limits, that the courts have been captured by his allies and the institutions have been broken and nobody is going to stop him from doing anything. But this ruling shows that is not entirely true yet. Federal judges are still willing to throw out improper prosecutions when the legal problems are obvious enough. The legal system still has some ability to push back against the weaponization of justice. The checks and balances are weakened significantly, but they have not completely collapsed yet. Point number 4. The chilling effect of these prosecutions remains even though the cases were ultimately dismissed, because the process itself is a form of punishment that sends the intended message to anyone watching. Comey and James had to spend months under federal indictment, not knowing if they would end up in prison for crimes they did not commit. They had to hire expensive lawyers and mount legal defenses that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and deal with the stress and uncertainty of facing criminal charges from the most powerful government on earth. Even though they won the case in the end, they still went through all of that suffering and expense, and everyone watching knows that could happen to them too if they do anything that makes Trump angry enough to target them. Point number 5. Trump will almost certainly try again with different approaches and different targets because he is not going to give up on using the Justice Department as a weapon just because these particular cases failed in embarrassing fashion. The retribution campaign is absolutely central to how Trump operates and how he maintains loyalty and fear among people who might otherwise oppose him publicly. Expect to see more indictments of Trump critics and more attempts to punish people who investigated him in the coming months and years. The question is whether those future attempts will be any more legally sound than these ones were, and whether the courts will continue to push back when they are not properly constructed. Point number 6. This ruling should be a wake-up call about what is actually happening to the American justice system under Trump's second term, regardless of your political affiliation or how you feel about the people being targeted. Using federal prosecutions to punish political enemies is the kind of thing that happens in authoritarian countries with strongman leaders, not in functioning democracies with independent courts and genuine rule of law. The fact that a president is openly doing this and that his supporters are cheering it on as justified payback represents a fundamental threat to the system of government that has made America stable and prosperous for over 200 years. Even if you personally dislike Comey or James or think they deserve criticism for various things they have done, using criminal prosecutions as political weapons is dangerous in ways that go far beyond any individual case. Point number 7. The contrast between how Trump was prosecuted and how he is prosecuting others tells you everything you need to know about his claims of being a victim of weaponized justice from partisan prosecutors. Trump constantly complained that the cases against him were politically motivated attacks designed to stop him from running for office, but those cases followed normal legal procedures with properly appointed prosecutors and judicial oversight at every step of the process. The cases Trump is bringing against his enemies cannot even meet basic procedural requirements that first-year law students learn about. They get thrown out immediately when a judge actually examines them with any care. If anyone is weaponizing justice in America right now, it is Trump, and he is doing it so sloppily that the cases cannot survive first contact with the courts. So where does this leave us going forward as we watch this situation continue to develop? We are in a very strange and dangerous place where the President of the United States is openly trying to imprison his political opponents, and the only thing stopping him right now is that his Justice Department cannot figure out how to do it in a legally proper way. That is not exactly a reassuring situation when you think about it. It means the desire to abuse power is definitely there. The authoritarian impulse is clearly there. The willingness to destroy democratic norms is obviously there. The only thing missing at the moment is the competence to execute the plan properly. But Trump has 4 years in this term, and he learns from his mistakes, and he has people around him who are getting better at navigating legal obstacles every day. The dismissal of these cases might just mean they come back later with better legal footing and proper procedures. Or it might mean Trump finds other ways to punish his enemies that do not require going through the courts at all. Either way, the threat has not gone away just because these particular prosecutions failed in embarrassing fashion. What happened with Comey and James is a victory for the rule of law, but it is a temporary and fragile victory in a much larger battle that is far from over. The courts held the line this time against improper prosecutions. They might not hold it next time when the cases are better constructed, and every day that Trump remains in power trying to weaponize justice is another day that the institutions protecting democracy get weaker and the authoritarian project gets stronger and more sophisticated. We have to keep paying attention to what is happening. We have to keep demanding accountability from everyone involved. We have to keep supporting the judges and prosecutors and investigators who are still trying to do their jobs despite enormous pressure to bend to Trump's will. Because if we stop paying attention, if we normalize what is happening, if we accept that using criminal prosecutions to punish political enemies is just how things work now in America, then we have already lost something precious that will be very hard to get back. That is the full story of Trump's revenge plot collapsing in court this week. That is what it means for the future of this country, and that is why everyone should be watching what happens next very closely. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about all of this. Is this ruling a sign that the courts can still hold the line against abuse of power? Or is it just a temporary setback for Trump's revenge campaign that will eventually succeed anyway through better legal strategy? Hit subscribe because this story is definitely not over. The battle over the weaponization of justice is going to continue for the rest of Trump's term and probably well beyond that. See you in the next one.